words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our life-giving source and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. Eight years ago, during Holy Week, I had the privilege of visiting the largest church in Christendom. Anybody know what that is? St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican in Rome. I was there during Holy Week. And I remember the visit as a multi-sensory experience, as I heard the echoes of visitors' footsteps and the whispers of distant prayers, and smelled and almost tasted the fragrant incense in the air, and beheld Michelangelo's magnificent Pietà and Bernini's bronze canopy called the Baldacchino that towered over the high altar. And I remember touching the cool and smooth feet of a bronze statue of St. Peter. Even before touching the feet, I could see that it had been touched and rubbed and even kissed by thousands, if not millions, of pilgrims before me. Peter's feet no longer looked like human feet, but more like those of a deformed duckbill platypus, since they had been eroded and worn down by the hands of countless pilgrims throughout the centuries. And even though it was a statue, pilgrims still experienced holiness and potential healing in simply touching the feet that had been touched and washed by Christ. And as Protestants, we have a healthy skepticism for devotion to statues and even icons. And yet I still felt something very powerful and sacred in touching something that had been so revered and venerated by so many lovers of Christ throughout the centuries. I felt a tangible connection to millions of other Christians, both dead and alive. And through that experience, I also felt a tangible connection to St. Peter and to Christ and to God. One of the central doctrines of Christianity is the doctrine of the Incarnation. And one of its primary implications is the belief that God makes God's self accessible to us through tangible and touchable matter, and through flesh. The word incarnation is made up of Latin words in carnos, in flesh. And Roman Catholics tend to incorporate this doctrine into their spiritual piety more so than Protestants. But this evening, we get to experience God by touching and washing each other's feet, just as Jesus washed Peter's feet and commanded us to do the same. Now, usually when preachers, including myself, comment on the foot washing of Maundy Thursday, we explain the foot washing as an expected act of hospitality within ancient Middle Eastern culture, where people often walked long distances without shoes or socks along dusty roads that were often covered with camel dung. And because people's feet often were very smelly and disgusting, this foot washing was generally expected to be performed by servants and slaves. So us preachers often highlight the great humility of Jesus, who meekly enacts the role of servant and slave as he washes his disciples' smelly feet before dying a slave's death on the cross. And this is a beautiful and historically accurate understanding of the foot washing practice, and one that helps us appreciate the spiritual depth of a practice that might seem rather foreign and even kind of awkward to us today. This context and understanding helps us to see the foot washing as a symbolic act of humility, and service, and hospitality, and self-giving love to one another, as a symbolic way of fulfilling Christ's mandatum to love each other as Christ loved us, the mandatum from which Maundy Thursday derives its name. However, I believe there is something even deeper going on in this symbolic act of washing each other's feet. Beyond symbolically showing our humility and love for one another, this act invites us to experience Christ in each other's flesh, to touch and wash the feet of Christ, the feet of God incarnate. In the Middle East and other Eastern cultures, the feet were much more than a body part that frequently required cleaning. Within Eastern culture, the feet of a spiritual master or guru or rabbi were considered to be channels of divine grace. In his book, Miracle of Love, spiritual teacher Ram Dass writes, touching, holding, rubbing the guru's feet has profound significance in the Hindu tradition. For out of the guru's feet comes the spiritual elixir, the soma, the nectar, the essence of the sacred Ganges River, the subtle prawn or energy that heals and awakens. To touch the feet of such a being is not only to receive this grace, but it is an act of submission, of surrender to God, for that is what the guru represents on earth. This Eastern understanding of feet helps illuminate references to foot washing and anointing within Hebrew and Christian scriptures, as well as within Western canon, Western classics. I've just been reading Homer's Odyssey, and at the end, Odysseus returns to Ithaca disguised as an old beggar, and one of his maidservants washes his feet and recognizes a scar that reminds the maidservant of Odysseus, and she realizes that this is the godlike Odysseus. It also illuminates references to foot washing within the Hebrew scriptures, especially in Genesis 18, when Abraham is visited by 3 visitors at the Oaks of Mamre, and he offers foot washing to them, and those visitors are revealed to be divine. These 3 visitors in Genesis are revealed to be God. And all 4 Gospels relate accounts of women anointing the feet of their rabbi, their guru, Jesus Christ, who comes to be understood as divine. The feet of spiritual masters are channels of divine grace. So it is indeed very scandalous and confusing for the divine Jesus Christ to venerate his bumbling disciples as bearers of divinity by washing their feet. It makes sense why Peter is so confused. Episcopal priest and author Dr. James Hughes Rio writes, from the perspective of his culture, Jesus, in washing his disciples' feet, is not only giving them an example of humility, which he is doing, he is also affirming to them that they themselves carry the divine within themselves, that they can and should function as channels of divine glory for others. He is venerating them as if they are already deified beings, because in one sense they and all of us already are. So according to this doctrine of the incarnation, the divine can be made manifest in material and flesh. We can experience the divine through our 5 bodily senses. And this evening, Christ invites us to experience the divine in one another, even in each other's flesh, in the intimate and sometimes awkward act of touching and washing one of the most sensitive parts of our entire body, our feet. So I invite us to relax into the potential awkwardness and intimacy and fleshiness and spiritual depth of this practice, and open ourselves up to the possibility that when we touch the feet of one another, each one of us bumbling disciples, we are acknowledging the divine within each of us, and we are actually touching the flesh of Christ, the flesh of God incarnate among us.